The shortness of the 24-mile Channel Tunnel that separates London from Paris can never provide enough justification to mix Anglo-Saxon capitalism with continental capitalism from Europe. Essentially, each distinct variety of capitalism has its own construct while defining how the fruits of industrial labor are to be confiscated and redistributed through society. Each of these two forms of capitalism are governed by a set of rules that set out to establish how income and wealth need be generated or redistributed through mainstream civil society. However, when one brand of capitalism is mixed with another, the conceptual foundations might weaken at its knees. Much of the political restlessness across Europe can be traced to the evolution of economic systems that are making working-class voters feel deprived. The English brand of Anglo-Saxon capitalism and continental capitalism might need to be shielded from each other, as their central governing principles and operational doctrines do not intermesh well. Nevertheless, the intermixing of these two disparate brands of Western capitalism under the umbrella of globalization created a hybrid economic system that was flawed. Perhaps Anglo-Saxon Britain should never have joined the European Union in the first place. Decision-makers in Brussels might not have the intellectual bandwidth of 18th-century polymaths to understand how the two varieties of capitalism can work ruinously against each other. Perhaps it would have taken a sharp-nosed René Descartes or an tubby Blaise Pascal to advise France not to have significant business dealings with the Anglo-Saxon capitalists of Britain and America. In the days of the British Empire, the British government was able to govern large parts of Asia through a multinational trading company that came to be known as the East India Company. Most young adults in Britain are proud of their colonist heritage. However, when an Anglo-Saxon culture-dominated nation advances industrially, profits accumulate excessively with business corporations. Thereafter, business entities end up becoming the custodians of national wealth. For instance, the East India Company had once been the chief custodian of wealth. Technological innovations have been contributing to increased productivity in the West. However, in knowledge economies of the West, only innovators are entitled to enjoy the profits from enhanced productivity. In other words, those who have not stood in the front lines and spearheaded innovation run the risk of being cut off from the economic loop. Therefore, nearly 65% of the world's population will be cut off from the economic loop. This will eventually lead to political instabilities of the kind occurring in the West Asian Middle East region. Until about 1950, however, capitalism was being touted as an economic system that would help create a swelling middle class. In the last century, however, Capitalism 1.0 discovered that the endeavor of creating a large middle class was an exercise in futility. In fact, needless procreation of the human species was creating a bottomless pit. Studies have revealed that the overpopulated world is using up resources at least 1.5 times faster than the natural rate of renewal. With excessive procreation, the demand for food, water, and land is outpacing the planet's natural biocapacity. It is estimated that the carbon footprint of humans and cattle make up more than 60% of the ecological footprint. As it would be an ineffectual exercise to uplift an endless stream of people out of grinding poverty, Capitalism 2.0 is about helping concentrate wealth in the hands of a few. Therefore, the current objective of capitalists is to create a super-rich class and forget about the rest. Nevertheless, Capitalism 3.0 should be about distributing profits more equitably to avoid violent political upheavals of the kind occurring in the Middle East region. The computer technology revolution and the financial revolution brought economic advancement only to those with an advanced level of college education. Within a short span of 20 years, these two revolutions created a disenfranchised working class made up of the bottom 65%. Meanwhile, liberal democracies across the industrial world had failed to make room for a new generation of political and economic doctrines. In fact, liberal democracies were no longer able to guarantee sufficient economic democracy. In the $17 trillion American economy a few years ago, nearly 40% of what was perceived as profit from business was actually derived from the financial sector. About 20% of profit was derived from the retail industry. Only about 15% was contributed by the American manufacturing industry. It is the uninformed voter who wishes to offer an expert opinion to the elected politician, and even criticize the actions of the government. Among Greek scholars who tried to give some shape and form to the idea of a democracy, Socrates had a hunch that societies were largely made up of citizens who were either woefully ignorant or uninformed on issues of national importance. In fact, the uninformed voter was seen by the Greeks as the weakest link in a democracy. Therefore, there ought to be a screening test for those who wish to vote. Ignorant voters can elect the wrong type of candidate and take democracies down the wrong path. Perhaps, only citizens with an intimate knowledge of world history, sociology, political theory, and economics should be allowed to vote in democracies of the future. In fact, Greek scholars had always worried about political democracies eventually transforming themselves into mob rule. The fear was that unruly mobs, in a state of desperation, would eventually hand over a crumbling civilization to a brutal dictator. Distressed by the ignorance of the mainstream voter, Greek philosophers had even toyed with the idea of an epistocracy. In an epistocracy, only a select group of distinguished citizens would be allowed to vote. In such a political system, electoral outcomes would be influenced by an erudite pool of voters with advanced levels of knowledge and intelligence. Nevertheless, academicians in the West have been endorsing the idea of universal rights to vote. In fact, academicians see this as a more politically correct approach. But what these scholars seem to be overlooking is that most voters in a modern democracy tend to remain ill-informed about critical national and global issues. Today, beyond voting rituals and the electioneering fanfare, there seems to be very little intellectual deliberations within most modern democracies. Perhaps, the most demoralizing point is that the press has been unable to elicit adequate participation of the teeming masses in the intellectual process. True democracy is about social empowerment of the huddled masses. It is also about mainstream voters having intense dialogues with their elected representatives. Democracy should be about voters engaging actively with elected representative for at least 250 days in a year. The remaining 115 days in a year can be set aside for other mundane tasks such as general housekeeping and gardening. However, a grossly erroneous view being propagated in many developing nations is that the granting of rudimentary voting privileges and the holding of elections completes the establishment of a modern democracy. On the other hand, what these superficial practices often do is convert democracies into a farce. At least in the 21st century, mainstream voters in a democracy need to understand that constitutions are written to balance two major issues. The Constitution has to help protect the political rights of the average citizen. At the same time, the Constitution has to help protect the economic and property rights of the rich. Therefore, while a citizen is allowed to hold on to voting rights in a democracy, the rich are allowed to hold on to their properties and financial wealth. This is fundamental to democracies across the free world. However, college textbooks written by academicians rarely set out to explicitly explain this political ideal with greater clarity. Albert Einstein of Princeton University had once said that the value of an education is in training of the mind to think, something that cannot be learned from textbooks. In fact, there is a rare body of intuitive consciousness that subliminally resides outside the boundaries of knowledge mechanically crammed into the pages of a book. In many primitive societies, village folk demonstrate better abilities in deductive reasoning than urban citizens with college diplomas. It is only by about 2015 that voters in Europe and America began to self-discover through serious introspection that their voting privileges rarely translated into economic entitlements. No matter which political entity voters elected in Europe or America, their economic plight remained practically unaltered even over a period of 40 years. Most households remained permanently locked into the economic or social class they were born into. Liberal democracies across the world were inadvertently denying the working classes upward economic mobility. A type of homeostasis had set in most liberal democracies across the world. Furthermore, the political elites and chief economists remained unconcerned that homeostasis had set in. This state of equilibrium that homeostasis brought in meant that vast sections of mainstream society would be denied upward mobility during an entire lifetime.